Okay, you all had some questions to answer about this text. So let's jump right into this. So you pull this up. Okay. The first question is, when do you think this text was written? And if you haven't read it, you know, there it is. Go and scan it. When do we think this text was written? Good. So we have a when. How do we tell that? Good. Right. Where is that here? Yeah, ground zero. I wonder if I can have a little fun with these markers here. Good. Yeah, this was actually written. Actually, is there anything else that we can tell about when this might have been written?
Well, it was because they're talking about creating that Islamic cultural center. So that was
Right. So if we knew when that was, then we would know when this was written, right? So hence we would have to do some kind of background research, right? So let's see here. Let's see. I'm trying to find this one here. Next one.
Yes, right here. Because roughly consistent with polls taken since.
Right.
September 11th.
Yeah, so we have since September 11th. Good. And then we have here is talking about that house of worship. Right. Good. Okay, so we know it was written after September 11th. That's obvious, right? Since September 11th. And we know it was around when this thing was planning on being built. This article was actually written September 2nd, 2010. Okay? How would we, in what kind of similar ways would we be able to look at the biblical text and figure out the same kind of thing? What kind of things should we look for to be able to date a text?
Rulers, kings, wars.
What's that?
Historical facts.
Historical rulers, wars, events. Good, yeah. People living during that time. Right, so for example, think back to how Wellhausen was looking at the Pentateuch, right? And he said, we have here the author referencing Ur of the Chaldeans, right? Well, the Chaldeans didn't come on the scene until this time period, so we can date this text to around here, right? Think too, is this a little harder for us to maybe see with this, but about the kind of language that is being used. For example, and I apologize up front for this, if this article said the word twerk, right? It would be difficult to say that this text was written, you know, too much sooner or too much before that word kind of had a lot of cultural momentum, right? So for example, if this said twerk, we probably wouldn't date it even in 2005, right? So see, even we know, it says it's like with just what it says, we can say after 2001, but if it says the word twerk, we could say, oh, well, we can definitely date it till maybe like 2012, 13, right? It's not written until that time period, right? So those are other things. So things like language help us date things, right? The complexity of the language, the kind of words being used. Good. Now, second question. What can we tell about the author? Where is he or she from? What is his or her opinion about the situation? What do you guys think? What can we tell about the author?
Definitely knows
Might be
New
from
York.
New York.
Might be from New York. Why do you guys think he or she is from New York?
very opinionated about what people in
Yeah,
the
I could be opinionated about New York.
But it goes on to say that
But
we
she's
must
talking
stand
about-
and it's possessive pronouns.
Right.
Good. We stand, right? So New Yorkers, blah, 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 like other Americans have a way to go, we stand, right? This we is hearkening back to that New Yorkers. Good, so we know she's from New York, right? Now let's think about this too. What else can we know about her? She is a New Yorker. Do we think that she was alive during this time period? Yeah, she sounds pretty educated. Chances are she's not, what would that be now? Even, she's not like 12 years old.
No.
Right? So she's an educated person. She was alive during this time. That's going to influence how she writes. She is a New Yorker who lived through this experience. Politically active, yeah, she has these political opinions. Good. Do you think she's educated or not so educated? How can you tell? Yeah, she's got some really complicated language in here. Let's see.
Definitely not tiptoe
Yeah.
to word it.
Pinnacles. What's that?
I said it's not tiptoe to word it, sure.
You have to point me.
Third, fourth paragraph.
Basically, all crack is.
Oh, that's what I'm saying.
Let's go away.
Other side.
Other side? Oh,
Yes,
jeez.
Graciousness, the wisdom to choose what after 9/11 did.
Right here?
Yes, it says, has the wisdom to choose graciousness and reconciliation.
Yeah,
over
graciousness
triumphalism.
over triumphalism. Yeah, exactly. For some other things, they use the word furor, utopia of humanistic harmony, histrionics, being hysterical, right? It's a pretty that's a nice SAT word right there. Right, exactly. So she's probably educated, right? Something else we know about her. And if she's educated, we may know something about what kind of class she's from, potentially, right? If she's from the upper class, lower class, middle class, that may be, and that's not going to be something that holds as much for nowadays. But if we're looking back to the Old Testament, right, back to the Hebrew Bible, back 3,000 years ago, 2,000 years ago, that is going to hold a lot more, right? Good. Let's see here. So, how would we do the same kind of thing as far as thinking about who the author is if we're looking at the biblical text? What kind of things would we look for in the same way that we look for them here?
Well, we talked about the,
If it's a male or female?
That might be hard to tell.
Genre.
Genre, good. Yeah, we'll move into that in just a little bit. But yeah, definitely genre is one thing. But how can we tell something about the author? Is there any kind of clues we could look for about the author in the same way we look for clues here?
we can use the, whether they say things like we or our people or.
Good. So we can maybe tell what group they're from.
Yeah, I was
Right.
gonna add to that, like their place in society at the time.
Right. Good. So they're, let's see here. I know this is kind of a muddled note taking up here, but if we talk about who, in the Hebrew Bible, we can think about things like, we'll say class, right, where they are in society, education. We can find out maybe what group they're from, right, how they use kind of pronouns like we and stuff like that. We could also maybe tell a little bit about the kind of, I don't want to say this, the kind of cultural group they're from, right? So for example, kind of, and this is obviously a somewhat shallow reading, but this kind of perspective in modern America usually gets called liberal, as opposed to being very right-wing conservative, right? So those kinds of guesstimates based on opinion, right? So when we start looking at the biblical text, we can be like, oh, this person has a very negative view of the North. Chances are they're from the South, right? Or this person views every Southern king as completely flawed, bet they're from the North, right? They're taking shots here at people who aren't part of their group, right?
Or they do landmarks.
Yeah, definitely. Landmarks they're familiar with, what they call landmarks, right? For example, people in the North usually refer to Mount Sinai as Mount Horeb, whereas people from the South call it Mount Sinai. So which language they use to describe that exact same thing is going to give us a clue to where they're from. Exactly.
So is there anything in there that would let us know if more than one person wrote?
And this, that may be tough. It's not a very common thing for U.S. literature to be written, or like modern literature to be written in the same way that ancient literature is. But that is a good question. It'd be interesting to try to pull that apart. But this seems, I think this seems pretty consistent in tone of voice, and in perspective and in kind of vocabulary being used. Okay, the third question was about the word tolerance, right? It appears a few times. When we start looking at the biblical text, it's going to be really important for us to look at what words pop up frequently. Because the more a word pops up, is that going to mean the word's like unimportant or important for the author? Right? It's an important concept. If an author keeps returning to a certain phrase or to a certain word, we should probably pay attention to that. Right? The word that pops up most in this is, or besides like a, the, that, is tolerance. All right, I'm always awful at finding where these are, but here's one.
One above that one.
There's one above that.
Above.
Yes. We have gruff tolerance in that one. And
And
there's
the first paragraph is freedom and tolerance.
this one?
At the very first paragraph.
The very first.
Freedom and tolerance at the end, last sentence.
Last sentence.
Oh.
Yeah. They're saying
Back to
freedom
your
and
right.
tolerance. Yeah, freedom and tolerance. Good. Okay, so here's our three examples of tolerance. Based on just the text, what does the author mean by it? Does he or she contrast it to other ideas? What kind of ideas does it get compared to? Good, it gets compared to understanding. Is it the same thing as understanding?
No.
No, right? So okay, here we have kind of the author's perspective on this word, right? It's not just understanding. Is it compatible with freedom?
It says and.
It says and, yeah, freedom and tolerance, right? It doesn't say freedom or tolerance, right? So those are compatible. We also have gruff tolerance, which is probably the most kind of loaded phrase in this, right? It says where gruff tolerance prevails and understanding thrives, right? So kind of doing the same thing when we look at the biblical text, right? Looking for words that pop up a lot. Let's see here. And English does this too. I mean, we have here with like tolerance, kind of being able to find one picture of what tolerance words, like one complicated picture by seeing all these different uses. But think about like the English word run, right? And how many ways you can use the word run, right? You run for president, your nose runs. What are some other examples of that? You run away, you run a race, you run through rehearsal, you run a company, you run tests. Newspapers run a story. They will run out of town. They run drugs, right? How long does the movie run? Right? Here's all examples of how we use one single word and the kind of flexibility that word has, right? And so that's one reason that some of those translations kind of go more for that thought for thought, right? Because whereas a word may have a lot of flexibility in Hebrew, that word may not have the same flexibility in English, right? Like the word horns. Horns doesn't have any flexibility in English, really, right? Or very minimal. What sources are cited? Good, New York Times poll. What does it mean that an author references a poll, or like references something? Yeah, it means they cite it. Why? What's that? Say, thank you. The New York Times poll, right? What would typically be your attitude towards a work that you were citing?
Use it to validate your.
So yes, so this person is using this to validate their own argument, which means they probably support this, right? So this is something else we know about the author, is that this author respects what the New York Times puts out, right? Which happens to be the same publishing company that put this out, right? So again, like things we can tell about the author, things we can tell about the perspective of where this person's coming from, even though you have no information whatsoever given to this article. Good. Does the author have a message or a goal or a particular point of view?
She definitely has a
What's the point of view?
She's for the, I mean, it's in the last paragraph, I think, is her final stand there. That it should be built.
Right? It should be built in Lower Manhattan because moving it would compromise American values. Here's something else we can tell about her. She's not saying American values are stupid, right? Okay. Come back. She's affirming American values, right? This is something she's saying that her whole argument kind of hinges on, is what it means for America to have certain values. Okay? So now is she just saying this is this just a report? What kind of genre is this? It's editorial, right? Editorials are persuasive, right? So we need to understand that what's going on here is not just blanket reporting, right? There are facts along the way, but just because there are facts doesn't mean that this is just a piece of history. And this is one thing that sometimes we get confused on when we start reading literature. We're like, oh, well, there's a bunch of facts. Surely they're just telling me a story. But no, this person in using these facts is trying to convey a message. And that message is primary. It's important for this author to cite legitimate things in backing up her argument. But on the whole, she is trying to convey a message. She is trying to get you to agree with him or her. Does that make sense?
Is it a her?
I think so, because my brain keeps going back to that. I'm not totally sure. And we can do the same thing when we look at the biblical text, right? When we're trying to find out the genre. And the genre is going to be really important. We'll talk about that on Wednesday. Good. Friday. There it is. All right. The last question here is, what kind of background information is needed to understand this? What's not said here that you would need to know? And this is hard because a lot of us do know this background and take it for granted. But what's not explicitly stated here that, give me more.
Why did that, like radical Muslims, like bombed the World Trade Center?
Right, so there's that connection,
Right,
right? So because there's that connection, that's not explicitly stated here.
right.
But that's what the author just assumes the audience knows. If this, if this article, for example, gets buried away and 2,000 years later somebody digs this up, right? Unless they know that story, they're going to be like, this is weird.
Yeah, like, what's the big deal?
What's the big deal, right? So, because of that, the same thing happens with the biblical text, right? And this is also why studying the documentary hypothesis is really important for us, because it doesn't matter. They're not just trying to find out who the author is just to say, no, it's not Moses, and like rub people's faces in it, right? They're doing it because they want to discover where these texts are coming from, or to better understand the events that may have surrounded where a text came from, to better understand who this author is, right? Is this author somebody who is concerned about priestly things? Is that why this author has a certain perspective, right? Is this person, cobbling together a lot of oral traditions? Is that why there's this kind of story, right? And so understanding who the author is and where the author is coming from and where certain text is coming from is really going to influence how we understand the text, right? And we don't understand as modern people as much when we read things like this, how much your understanding of a context impacts how you are able to understand a piece of literature. Until we start reading literature where you're like, I don't know where on earth this is coming from. And that's my hope, that like we can start seeing the Hebrew Bible as that. You're like, where on earth is this coming from?
So that's where the exegesis comes from, is what a person thinks of it. It's more the way you picture it.
Exactly. So that's what we're going to move on to Wednesday, is talking about exegesis and how to do what we did here kind of systematically. Okay?